G'day everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Before we kick off, do have an apology. Unfortunately, Tim Weaver's had to drop out at the last minute, but he's given us his slide deck. So between myself and Chris, we decided in the last 5 minutes that we'd just halve his slides, which means Chris will do 80%, I'll do 10%, and another 10 will float around. But that's all right. You'll just have to forgive us for being a little bit clunky with how we get through it. So I guess what Tim was going to talk about and what Chris will talk about is a bit more of the technical side of how we can manage whatever our nitrogen products are that we've got on hand for us at the moment, or what we can get. Prior to doing that, it feels important to me to lay out some of the basics and some of the frameworks so that we're all kind of starting on the same page. I think really critical to understand in terms of nitrogen cycling dynamics and efficiency is that, like everything good, it starts with the soil. So what you're looking at right now, this is the nitrogen cycle, and I've pulled this from NutriPack, and you can see that there's quite a lot going on here. There's a lot happening, which is pretty reflective of what our nitrogen does in our farming systems. Nitrogen's constantly cycling and changing forms and changing where it sits in the soil profile as well. We can see really important, and it stands out quite well, that there's two big pools of nitrogen that we've got cycling through this system, and that's our organic and our mineral nitrogen. Something important to call out here is that 2/3 of the plant nitrogen requirement is coming from the soil. So it's coming from the breakdown of this organic end pool, and only 1/3 is actually going to be supplied by the fertiliser that you're putting in that initial season. So really, I guess the way that I think about it is your fertiliser inputs, you're feeding the soil, which is then coming through to feed the plant rather than necessarily feeding the plant directly. So how do we get from our organic to our mineral end pools? Well, one thing it's really important to call out is that 95% of our soil land actually sits in that organic pool, but the mineral end, that's really where our plant food is. So that includes our ammonium, our nitrite, and our nitrate. This is all plant food. But if we were to figure out what cotton wants the most of, really is the nitrate. So if we're down the main street in Narrabri at Only Chinese restaurant at the buffet, cotton's standing there with its plate, it's going to load up on the nitrate. That's its main thing, and that's what it wants the most of. But it's really important that we can get the cycle happening from the organic through to the mineral end. So to do that, our organic end, it has to be mineralized, and that mineralization is driven by our soil biology, which in turn, our biology is then supported by the soil. So we can see that soil management is a really important part of this process. So this is just a bit of a call out to show the really important role that biology is playing in the mineralization process as it flows from organic end to mineral end. Immobilization is another thing which it's worth talking about. Immobilization is effectively the end tie-up that you might see off the back of if you've had a really big winter crop season, big heavy stubble load, or maybe you've tried out some cover crops. You might see a lag in your following cotton crop, and why that's happening is because your stubble is being broken down by your microbes. To do that, I guess you could think of it like the microbes need some nitrogen to, I guess, supercharge them to be able to consume that carbon in your stubble. And they're taking that nitrogen from your mineral end pool. So short term, it'll sometimes outcompete the crop for that mineral end to break it down, which is your nitrogen tie-up. But overall, it's still part of this system and it will mineralize over time. The other part where the biology plays a really big role in this nitrogen cycle is when we're actually in the mineral end pool. And this is where your fertiliser comes into the scene a bit as well. So if you're using gas or if you're putting out urea and it goes through hydrolysis, that can take a few days to get through to the ammonium end pool. So as you go through that ammonium cycle, you go through nitrification, which is another microbially driven process to then finally end up at nitrate. And, you know, talking about the buffet, that's what cotton wants the most of. So I guess something to note within the nitrification process, just a bit of context, the biology is going to work faster and harder in warmer environments than it is in colder environments. So I guess if you're up in the tropics or around Emerald or something like that, your biology's working a bit harder and this process will happen quicker than if you're down south in Collyamberley or Griffith. But importantly, it is all a biological process, and that's what you've got to consider. So then I guess the question is, what can we do to support our biology? Well, we can think about what our biology needs. If we look at our cotton soil health framework, we know that biology needs food and biology needs a home. So like us, they're living things, they need to eat and they need somewhere to live. Food for biology is something that we've already touched on, and that's our organic matter and our carbon that the biology needs to break down and keep our cycle going. So if we've got soils with really good organic matter levels, then we're supplying a good amount of food to our soil biology. What does biology need in a home? Well, it lives in the soil and it wants a good, well-structured home, which is porous. That porosity helps us hold moisture and hold oxygen because, again, biology is alive. It needs oxygen and it needs moisture as well. How can we influence that? We can think about these principles of soil health. Okay. So biology is pretty hard to influence directly, but some things we can influence are our physics and our chemistry. So some of the physical levers that we can pull, we can think about our soil compaction, which flows on into structure and porosity. So we can think about maybe the times where we've had to traffic the field and it's been a bit wet, or if we've done a bit of wet tillage or something like that, and those things will flow on to affect our structure and our porosity. Soil moisture and soil temperature also play really big roles in driving our biological activity. And, fair enough, you can't help when it does or doesn't rain and you can't really control the temperature. But by influencing our structure and our porosity, those things can act as, I guess, mediators for moisture and temperature. Nice porous soil holds moisture well, but it also resists waterlogging. So it gives the biology a really good environment to live in. If we move to chemistry and we talk about our soil carbon again and our organic matter, that's our microbe food. So if we're thinking about what's happened with our farming systems, maybe we've got a big stubble load, but not all stubble's created equal or created the same. And this is where we talk about our carbon to nitrogen ratio. If we're thinking about our carbon to nitrogen ratio, crops like our cereals and our, wheat, maize, sorghum, and so on, even cotton has a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So what that means, I spoke a little bit about nitrogen supercharging the microbes to consume the carbon. It takes them a long time to break down high carbon to nitrogen ratio stubbles. And that can result, again, in tie-up if there's too much of it, because they'll consume some nitrate and to be able to do that. Then again, we've got other stubbles from crops like legumes. And if you think about off the back of a faba bean crop, how quickly does that stubble residue disappear in the field? Disappears really quickly. And that's because there's more nitrogen balanced in with the carbon in that stubble. So the microbes can break it down easier. Soil pH can be hard to influence in a lot of our farming systems because we're on a lot of really alkaline clays for a fair bit of our cotton industry, but it is something that influences our microbial activity. And so too do soil constraints like sodicity and salinity. So I guess that's talking a bit about how the microbes are driving our nitrogen availability. But just to address some of the loss pathways, soil physics is pretty important in some of these stages as well. So if we're thinking about pre-season fertilisation and bed prep, we want nice, well-structured beds, but we want beds with a good fine tilth as well. If we've done bed prep and it's really blocky and cloddy and you're putting out gas or urea or whatever, as it goes through its cycle and goes through gaseous phases, it can actually escape through the gaps in the clods. So it is important to have well-structured beds, but beds with a fairly good fine tilth as well. Volatilisation is another pathway for loss, especially if we're on alkaline soils like we are for much of our industry. And that can happen if you've placed the fertiliser a bit too low, usually below 10 centimetres, or if you've spread it and you've had a sprinkle of rain or something like that. So probably the main pathway for loss in our really heavy clays is denitrification. So this happens when we don't have well-structured soil. If we've got parts of our soil that have been compacted and don't have good porosity, when we get a waterlogging event, there's no air in that soil space. And, as we've said, the biology, it's alive, it needs oxygen. If you're not giving it air in porosity, it's going to take its oxygen anyway. Where it's going to get that from is from your nitrate, from your really good quality plant food. So the biology will actually consume oxygen in your NO3, which then makes it change form to N2 or N2O gas, and then you lose that to the atmosphere. So the biology is going to get its oxygen anyway. And yeah, this is probably the biggest loss pathway in our heavy clays. The other loss pathway, which is worth calling out, is leaching. And this is going to be a bigger problem on lighter soil types that are a bit more free draining than the clays. I guess what this means is that unfortunately for the coming season, there aren't too many levers that you can pull directly in terms of soil management that are going to be able to be immediately helpful to you right now. I think it does warrant calling out our tillage practices, things like that. So if you're super wet when you're trying to till, that is going to cause compaction and it is going to cause smearing, which will lead to denitrification. I think also thinking about how we manage our bed prep is pretty important too. Largely, these are a lot of systems level things, which are going to influence how our nitrogen use efficiency functions in our soils, but they are worth thinking about. So if you're considering what paddocks to go into this season, I think in the coming season, if you really are thinking about nitrogen use efficiency, you want to be looking for paddocks with strong rotation histories, if possible. If you've got a diverse rotation with cereals and legumes, that's really great. But typically, we're going to be looking at our fields that have been our best yielders, our best performing fields. So these will usually be fields with good levels of organic carbon. What that means for you will vary depending where you sit in the cotton landscape. So in the Namoi, pushing up towards 1% organic carbon is pretty good. But I think probably what you want to be doing is thinking contextually within your own farm setting, and you want to be looking at your soil tests and I guess picking within your own settings there. We're really chasing these well-structured, free draining soils. If you want to try and pick paddocks that suit this, you can think back, well, say Northern New South Wales, Southern Queensland last season, we had a lot of wet picks. Those are probably paddocks to avoid because it will take some time to recover that soil structure in those systems. But you can also think about when you've had heavy rain events, and I mean, you'll know your paddocks or your clients' paddocks, which take a fair bit of time for the water to get away on. So I'd suggest those are not very well structured soils compared to hopefully others on your place. And I think it's also worth thinking about what constraints you might have in your soil. So this could be sodicity or salinity, but pH extremes as well. Again, I know it's really hard to influence pH in our alkaline soils, but if you have the ability to choose fields, you're better off going for a field trending more towards neutral, around 7 pH, because this is going to help your nitrogen use efficiency overall. So I guess ultimately the messaging here is that a lot of this stuff is systems level, but I think if we're coming into seasons where we're going to be a bit picky and choosy, then I think it probably really is about putting your best field forward. So we might move on to Tim's slide deck. And there's a couple of call outs here. So Tim has lovingly put this together, which now Chris and I can take the credit for, which is nice. So what Tim wanted to speak about, I guess, was understanding your paddock history, which we've touched on a little bit already, so that it can tell your nitrogen story and you can understand what kind of stored soil N you've got. He's also wanted to talk about the timing of N application, which I guess is where I'll pass over to Chris. So what's the paddock history? We've already sort of touched on this, and I guess, things to consider are you coming out of a fallow paddock, or what was your rotation history? With this, we're thinking about our carbon to nitrogen ratio. So as we've touched on, legumes, for example, will have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio than a cereal crop. And this means that it's going to affect the speed of breakdown and mineralization of that organic matter. So unfortunately, if we've got a nitrogen shortage, if we're thinking about putting in a legume cover crop this season, that's really cool. But again, it's got to be big systems level changes, and it's very unlikely that that legume will be able to supply you the nitrogen you need in the coming summer. But it will break down quicker than, say, if you have a cereal crop in there. So this is all about the crop biomass, how much biomass you have, where you sit in that landscape. Again, considering that if you're in a more tropical environment, you'll have your stubble break down a lot quicker than if you're really far down south. And something I haven't really touched on is soil types. So this is going to play a role in the way that nitrogen cycles and functions. It's going to play a role in where you get denitrification or leaching as well, and it will affect your mineralization rates too. So I guess it's just about understanding what's happened historically in that field to try and make a prediction of how it's going to behave going forward. I think when I spoke to Tim as well, he wanted to put a lot of emphasis on really, really good, robust soil sampling for this coming season because, it felt really important to understand what platform you're coming from going forward to manage your nitrogen. And he gave this example of what he's observed, and I think it's highlighted in this map up in his top right-hand corner of nitrate movement through the field. So in an irrigated environment, you're always going to have higher nitrates in the tail drain than in the head because your nitrogen goes where the water goes, right? So Tim's suggestion for this is to divide your paddock into thirds and take 1/3 of your samples in the top, 1/3 in the middle, and 1/3 in the tail drain to get a clear picture of your nitrogen dynamics through that. So I suppose in summary, you need to be considering where you sit in the cotton landscape if you're in a tropical environment or if you're moving further south, because that will slow the rate of mineralization. And also consider what your last rotation crops were and how that's sitting in your system. And I think thinking about your organic matter, the levels that are there, and I guess the quality of that organic matter relating to carbon to nitrogen ratios. And as the point Tim makes, I think it'll be really, really important to have a thorough understanding of your nitrate levels in that paddock, where you're sitting and where that can take you to going forward. I think if you're reading down the bottom, C is cotton, V is vetch, and W is wheat. And then you've got different rates sitting out through that. So I guess that just highlights the role that crop rotation is playing in your nitrogen dynamics there. I might pass to Chris for this one. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Blake, and welcome all. The information that Tim's presenting here is about what's changed in the last 10 or 15 years around the attitude towards split application, or the notion of not putting any pre-plant on and putting it all on in crop under the right circumstances. My take on why this has happened, or what has precipitated the ability to do this and the change away from the all up front, is the, I suppose, predominance now of Bollgard, well, starting with InGard, but now we've got Bollgard varieties that take the pressure off controlling chewing insects to give us concentrate on other agronomy such as irrigation and nitrogen management. So taking that away, one, logistically on the farm, it fits in to be able to do something else in crop. So, it's probably not inconsequential that the timing of that introduction of that technology into the varieties has precipitated the research now that says split application is no worse than, and in some cases can be better than, all up front. So Tim's just highlighted a few experiments here that have been conducted between 2013 and 2017 using urea, and just compared the effective timing all up front in September, which means that it probably wasn't lost prior to application of water and crop establishment, and then December and even later into January, where they've split it 120 and 80 as a side dress. And then the second experiment he wants to highlight is where they've applied 200 in December, January or February and had a look at the effect of that, as well as a September application of 200 kilograms of NS urea. So you can see the layout, and we're really talking about the 2013-14 experiment and 2015-16, and in particular the January application. Sorry, that's offset compared to what the original was. So looking at the 2013, the 200 in December versus the 2015-16 experiment where the 200 applied in December. So when highlighting what the effect of delaying that nitrogen was, there was no effect compared to putting it all up front. So certainly there was a yield increase, and that's always important when you're trying out a new product or a new application methodology or timing, to always have a control in there to say, yes, we got a response, and the difference or the lack of difference is related to the treatment rather than whether we got a response at all or not. So you can see the control was 8 bales relatively across the years. And in the experiment, treatment 3 was 200 in December. So we could either have it treatment 1 all up front or all of it in December. There was no difference. And overall, there was a 4 to 5 bale increase from 200 kilograms of N, which is about 25 kilograms of lint per kilogram of N applied. And I'll talk to you a little bit later about what that really means. That's very, very important in that type of response in the current circumstances we're facing with the urea situation. And the other experiment, 2015-16, you can see, again, the control was 8 bales, but there was no difference between the timings all the way through to February. So in that year, putting the 200 on across those timings, and in that year the nitrogen started at 70 kilograms per hectare in the top 60 centimetres. So it had some nitrogen to start with in the top 60 centimetres, and the extra 200 really could, in that year, we're able to delay, and it didn't make much difference. But you can see the yield response was so much smaller. So there's only 1 or 2 bales in that year. So obviously the yields were lower, the response was lower, so the nitrogen being late relatively didn't make that much difference. The next experiment is 2022, and the soil test results had 870 in the soil, 0 to 60, and you can see the distribution. There wasn't a lot in the surface soil, and most of the nitrogen, the majority of the nitrogen was below 60 centimetres. So you would expect in those sort of seasons that a little earlier response may have been had because the crop was growing on sort of fairly low numbers early in the season. Fairly busy graph, but it basically shows that there was a response in each of those situations, and that there's 2 varieties there, and that's the comparison there. And you know, if we look at the middle line in the middle of the box, it basically says that compared to control, again about 8 bales, and we've got another 4 or 5 bale response, which is, you know, it's a pretty good return on investment if you're getting 5 bales for 200 kilograms of N. That's 15 kilograms of N of lint per kilogram of N. That's the zone that you want to be in. And really the timing, there was very little difference between the varieties and the timing when it was applied. So if we've got some nitrogen in the soil, it appears that we can actually delay decisions about how much we need later, and it becomes more a product availability and logistics issue of getting it on the ground later on rather than spreading it out pre-plant versus in the crop. So the summary I think Tim was trying to make from this paper is that the crop side dress urea increased uptake and growth and reduced losses. Obviously by delaying applications and the number of irrigations it's got to go through and the number of pre-waterings, it reduces the exposure to those conditions that are going to denitrify nitrogen in a cotton or leaching. So if you're irrigated in sandy soils, so obviously your less losses, greater efficiency, greater uptake means you're getting more dollars return for the nitrogen you put on. So this whole delay thing, which we've seen a move towards in the last probably 5 or 6 years, is probably a very important. It's just a matter of how much can we delay and under what circumstances. So it would appear that whether you put on one single application in crop or multiple splits really hasn't changed too much in the overall outcome. But as I was saying, there's limits to what you can apply in crop according to what equipment and what labour you've got available. So sometimes logistics says it's better to do it in smaller doses and more regularly than try and put a big rate on at once. Mineralisation provides enough from previous season to delay until single application in December. So, you know, and that obviously is probably an early application, and it could go another 3 weeks after that, you know, into that squaring to flowering time frame. And a single application then followed by in-crop monitoring is probably a good way to go when we're in situations where nitrogen might be running short in availability or we're trying to optimise efficiency. On to something I actually know about. What I'm going to talk about now is refining seasonal fertiliser tactics just based on some of the principles I work on when I talk to people season to season, and are probably the ones that are emphasised in this particular season coming with the situation we've got with nitrogen fertiliser availability. So, some of the factors that we would consider when we're tailoring a fertiliser budget to suit whatever the conditions are, and then just what we call the 4N factors to try and get our tactics, or look at the tactics and options we've got around the products, and how do we prune rates if we're going to do that, how do we change our timing, and the pros and cons of different timings and methods of application. So the big question I think is facing us this season is, are we facing, and these different scenarios have very different outcomes as far as the choices we make right now, or the options we take off the table and the ones we leave on the table. So are we looking at a season where it's high price only? So the price of urea goes from $700, $800 a tonne to $1,200 to $1,400 a tonne. There's a very different scenario than if we have a high price, which I think is taken now that's going to happen, but it's not something we haven't seen before. This was the same as we saw a couple of years ago during COVID. We did see those spikes up into the $1,200 to $1,300 a tonne for urea. Are we seeing high price and short supply just for the pre-plant season? Or are we seeing high price plus a shortfall in supply for the full season? So that shortfall in supply lasting through to the new year. And they're going to have very, very different outcomes as to what we should consider. Just as Blake put up there the nitrogen cycle, I've stuck up here a very abbreviated one in how I look at where's the nitrogen coming in the crop. I've used an average of 60% from soil sources. Blake's talked about 2/3, 66. I'm not going to quibble over that small amount, but that's coming mostly from organic turnover, including the soil biology, and residual soil mineral N. They're the two components that are making that up. We can obviously measure the soil mineral N, and that's what we do with a soil test in generality. The organic turnover is probably coming from two places, and this is where having an idea of history is pretty important. So, that organic turnover, or the source of the organic matter for that turnover, comes from the two sources, as you can see in the bottom left-hand side of that diagram, crop residue nitrogen. So that crop residue that is turning over, and I count usually 3 years of the previous cropping history as residue that's contributing to the current crop. So if that's a legume, then it's going to be very different to a wheat crop or a high biomass cotton crop, in which the leaf will turn over pretty quickly versus the stems. They all contribute to that labile residue that's turning over. You've got the organic matter, the soil, what you call soil organic matter, and this is classically what's measured in your soil organic carbon number if you soil test. It's that highly turned over source of organic matter that's humic. It's high concentration, but it's slow turnover because it's been chewed over that many times by the bugs. There's not a heck of a lot of digestible stuff in there for them, but it's a huge amount. We're talking about hundreds, even thousands of kilograms. That's not a Donald Trumpism either. That's hundreds or thousands of kilograms of nitrogen sitting there in that form that can turn over and tip some nitrogen out for the crop. And the important part of organic matter turnover is it turns over whenever it's warm and wet, and it's just particularly coincidental with the growth of the crop. We see a lot of nitrogen coming out of these sources actually in crop compared to something like a winter crop. So when we talk about these things, there's two components of them, quantity and efficiency, and not all of the sources of nitrogen that's coming into the crop are equal in their quantity or efficiency in any one season. So slow release, particularly coordinated with plant uptake requirement, gives you high efficiency. Unfortunately, the amount that's coming out of our residues and our organic matter in the soil, because they tend to be low comparably, high efficiency but low quantity, whereas the mineral N is moderate efficiency and variable quantity, and the fertilizer can be little or a lot, but generally we understand that it's of low efficiency compared to the other sources. So we've got these combinations that play out every season, and it's why it's good to understand the cropping history, the soil organic matter content, the soil mineral, and to understand possibly what the fertiliser might be required. Because if we're going to refine it during the season, we've got to decide which ones of those pools we're going to count in and which ones we're going to discount. So whenever I speak to growers, or I've spoken, I ask them, what is my seasonal N rate? Is it okay now? How well am I doing? And how do I classify my paddocks as to whether they're highly efficient now, in which case I might decide to continue on with those paddocks. They're highly efficient, I'm going to get good return, especially if they're low in mineral N and the fertiliser N goes into under high efficiency, I'm going to get more dollars back per kilogram of N that I apply. And then how do I know which ones are not so good? And in those ones that are not so good, I have an opportunity to understand whether I can improve efficiency. I can cut the rate because the low efficiency is just because I'm putting too many wraps around the arm. Or are there paddocks out there that are inherently low in efficiency because there is some other constraint? And that's very important, because if you've got paddocks like that, you're growing to make up the area in any one year, and you're willing to accept some low efficiency areas in a year where there is a season long or partial season lack of product to apply, you're better off leaving them out and go for the moderate to high efficiency ones, because they're going to give you the return on the dollar. Leave out the ones that have got another constraint that are upsetting and giving you low efficiency. So how do I know? Well, if you look at the green and purple numbers there, the green ones for well-structured soils, and the purple ones you could probably apply to soils that have maybe some minor structural issues, like some sodic subsoils, and they're not quite as good as the best soils in producing the number of kilograms of lint per kilogram of N applied. Now that table, if there's an example there, if you're growing 15 bales and putting on 300 kilograms of N, your efficiency, and that PFPN is the partial factor productivity for nitrogen, is 11.4. It's pretty good. 12 is the cutoff for being green. So, you know, that's doing pretty well. So that's, if you look at, you know, you can think about a paddock that you grew last year, you look at the yield that you achieved and the nitrogen rate and put it on that table. It'll give you an understanding of whether, you know, it's acceptable or not. So if we're getting down around 6, one, you've got to question whether all of that nitrogen was warranted. And to some extent, I would say if you've got a starting soil nitrate nitrogen from last year over 100, probably getting close to 200, and had to apply 3 lots of defoliant, it probably indicated there was more left at the end of the season. And if that wasn't applied late, to possibly cut back a bit in a year like we've got one coming. So there's some strategies we can actually look at around just where you land on that table to sort out the paddocks as to what we're going to do this year. So how do I know which paddocks are going to produce high nitrogen use efficiency? Well, I always look at this and say high nitrogen rates and low efficiency are a result of treating an effect rather than the cause. Because the nitrogen rate that actually suits the paddock is related to your water efficiency, the lack of leaching, the lack of denitrification, the lack of overland flow of urea that's taken from head ditch to tail drain and maybe out the end of the paddock. And also in concert with that is soil structure. So water and structure to go together. And if I've got poor watering management and I've got poor structure, you're going to have low water efficiency and high rates relative to the yield you're able to produce. Soil structure, I think this is where, you know, I'm probably overlapping a bit with Blake here, with rotation, fallow history, organic carbon level, inherent aggregate stability that comes from the chemistry, so sodicity, compaction, soil texture are the major factors that you'll look at there. So if I've got a good rotation, fallow history, high organic carbon, high aggregate stability, no compaction, and a texture of soil that allows water infiltration, then soil structure is probably optimized. As far as water, the application method, the application efficiency, distance to source, and quality are important. And then finally, when we get to nitrogen, how much mineral nitrogen is in the root zone, the seasonal mineralization potential, how we use the fertiliser, and the logistics goes with how we use the fertiliser. And if we put all that together properly, we should end up with the ability to produce pretty high yields at high efficiency. So how do we know where fertiliser might be required? Look, I've put a list there of a lot of things that you can take into account in the absence of measuring something. But the three things that are important in understanding where it might be required is the rotation history, the soil organic carbon content, and rainfall in fallow, and also measuring the soil mineral N content in the root zone. All those three things will head you towards understanding just how much you may have in the soil, and it'll help you sort out just what to do moving forward. So if we concentrate on mineral N, this is a table I put together a few years ago, just based on observation and some other information that's coming from soil testing. It basically says, and I think we went a long way past just using nitrogen content in the soil to predict the rate of nitrogen, well, which is somewhat of a nonsense, because a lot happens between the time you soil test and the time the crop actually stops taking up nitrogen. It is a good indication, but I think it's an even better indication about how tactics fit into split application. So what I've been doing is using the soil nitrate in 0 to 60 to come up with a hedged tactical plan around splitting nitrogen. And that's on the basis that, yes, if we just put it all up front, we know we're losing nitrogen during the watering up phase and in the first 2 in-crop waterings. You know, the stuff that Ben McDonald and John Baird did that showed that very, very clearly, that they're the 3 main periods we lose nitrogen. So the less we can have hanging out there and the more we can put into later in the crop, particularly just before flowering, the safer we're going to be and the less we're actually putting out there and being at risk. So part of that is knowing that you've got enough nitrogen to get you through from planting to probably early squaring. And the soil nitrogen can tell you, the nitrate, the mineral nitrogen can tell you a little bit about that. So, I've said there, if you've got less than 25 kilograms per hectare to 60 centimetres, which would relate to a soil test value of less than 3 milligrams per kilogram down to 60 centimetres, then you probably need to think about getting up to 50% up front prior to sowing. And the remainder probably should be 1 to 3 applications, certainly 1 in the period between squaring and flowering, because we do not want a crop in the first 2 weeks of flowering starting behind the 8 ball with nitrogen requirement. It's very hard with these very determinate high yielding crops to catch up with nitrogen if you get behind in that late vegetative, early reproductive period. So as we go up, you can see through each of the levels of nitrogen. As the nitrogen in the soil goes up, the amount pre-plant goes down, and ultimately the number of in-crop applications reduces. And the number of in-crop applications I've put in as multiples because sometimes the logistics of running in one application at a very high rate can be a bit difficult. And I get a lot of questions about, can I put on 400 kilograms flown on in crop and incorporated? That is 1, costly, and 2, there are some risks with it. You can see that table gets to a point where we've got greater than 24 milligrams per kilogram down to 60 centimetres, and we've seen them twice that in the past. Then there's probably not a lot of call for nitrogen to go on pre-plant. If any remainder might be required later on. There's one caveat to this. It depends on where that nitrogen is as well. It's not only amount, but it's where is it. Now, each of those graphs depicts there being 150 kilograms of nitrogen in the soil. The first one, by far the majority, 110, is in the surface soil. Now that one is a classic example of where you probably net of losses that happen between the time we measure this and early squaring, then that probably doesn't require nitrogen. The next one is where it's in that 30 to 60 layer, and there's a question mark over whether those small seedlings and up until pinhead square, there mightn't be a need for a small amount of nitrogen. The third graph depicts that there's only 60 kilograms excuse me, of nitrogen above 60 centimetres, and there's a lot down deeper. And that obviously requires different consideration as to how much pre-plant nitrogen we might put on and how much might be required in total. So let's look at the economics. And what this graph is looking at is if I move that green line back towards the left, it says the soil supply is less and the fertiliser requirement is greater. Now on the top there you can see I've got numbers of 20 down to 0. Now this is to represent the amount of lint per kilogram of fertiliser N applied as we go from the soil supplying a lot and fertiliser supplying a little bit to where the fertiliser is supplying a lot and the soil is not supplying very much at all. So, when we've got fertiliser N supplying a lot of the requirement, the efficiency, as long as we've got everything else right, tends to be high. But as we move towards adequacy, the efficiency of the fertiliser gets less and less until we get down to none is required, there's no response. So what I've done is just construct a little table to say, look, if urea this past season was 700, $6.90, $1.50 a kilogram, and versus what happens if we double the price, and down the left-hand side is cotton at $4.50 a bale versus 700. It's probably a range that we look to work in. And what I put there is 5 kilograms of lint. In other words, not a very responsive paddock. The soil's supplying a lot and the fertiliser that you put on is not going to give you a very big response. 5 kilograms of lint per kilogram of N is basically 2 bales per 100 kilograms of N that's applied. So that's not a very high efficiency. At the other end is what happens at 15 kilograms. So, that's more like 4 bales for 100 kilograms of N applied. So in the case of the 450, you can see for every $1.50 we apply, you get $9.91 back. If it's at 5 and $29. So, at 450 to $700 and $1.50 a kilogram for nitrogen, it's not till you get down to 1 kilogram of lint per kilogram of N applied that it becomes break even. So in that area there, and this doesn't include application costs, risk, borrowing money, that would probably take it out to 2 or 3 to 1 as being a good risk for putting on nitrogen fertiliser in cotton, because it's pure economics. So this is just cost and return. And there's other risks and risk costs and other uses that money could go to, and that would affect the return ratio that you're looking for. But certainly nitrogen makes a lot of sense when it's $1.50 a kilogram of N and $450 to $700 for a bale. So let's go to the next level and see what happens if we go to $3. And you can see the returns the same, but the ratio have changed. So at $4.50 a bale, if we're looking at $4.50 to $500, and only 5 kilograms of lint per kilogram of N applied, then we're getting to the point where the risk and the alternate use of that money and the application costs are probably making it a little bit iffy. Certainly at $700, it looks pretty comfortable. And certainly if we're picking paddocks where we're putting the nitrogen and getting consistently average lint increase per kilogram of N of 15, then it is quite economical and quite safe to do so, even at that nitrogen price. So if nitrogen prices are our only concern, then just looking for paddocks that are going to respond to nitrogen and are going to have good efficiency and be able to produce high amounts of lint per kilogram of N, then it makes sense to continue on. So let's look at what our decisions are as far as products, rates, timing. So products, urea, probably will be here for the pre-plant, but the question mark, as I said, is the supply and how long the supply might be affected once we get past the end of April into May, which is now an uncertain period. And the question of EEF, well, I look at EEFs and talk to people about it as being risk insurance. So if we're going to be pruning rates to the extent that 10, 20% of nitrogen that they are able to save compared to not treated when used at the right timing, and you're going to prune your rates by 30%, and this makes a 20% difference to losses, then it may become significant in that season. So as far as urea concerned, yeah, plus or minus, that's a number you've got to have to look at in the particular circumstances and say, just because it's gone to 1380 doesn't mean we prune the cost by taking away things like nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors, because they may well be a good insurance at that higher cost. Other options, sulfate of ammonia. I think probably a lot of people are looking at that, and given if we have an issue with urea coming into top dressing in southern markets, I think most of that will probably disappear fairly quickly into winter crop, and there probably won't be a lot residual into to later on. Anhydrous ammonia is still around, and plus or minus nitrification inhibitor, a little bit the same as urea. And biosolids, the question mark over them is around release rates. So we have to make sure that they're releasing in time for the crop to be able to get at the nitrogen that they may release. So it comes down to the characteristics of the product, the form release characteristics, the concentration, which feeds into logistics. If it's half the concentration, then you've got to double the rate, which means you've got to refill twice as often. That plays into the costing of it. The physical handling characteristics of the products, particularly when we get into, I suppose, off-grade type things that are not generally used for fertiliser, just need to be careful of that, because that again can play into the logistics, and the relative price in or on the ground is pretty important. So as far as the rate is concerned, if we want to get it up front, it could be no change. If you're getting 15 kilograms of lint per kilogram of N, I'd probably say, and the price is the only consideration you're looking at, then it's no change. It just means you're going to get a reduced amount of lint per kilogram of N, but it still should be quite economic compared to trying to do something else. You can use a decision support like Soilmate, or which is basically the same as Nutralogic used to be, and it'll give you like a budget. We can do a simple budget. You can use enriched strips if you want to go that way, and remote sensing. You can use a pools budget. You can use a measure and feed approach. So put a little bit on, use plant tissue to guide tactics based on what you should do next for the next irrigation cycle, or you can use last year's rate minus a little bit. So, using that table that I've put there in the bottom right-hand side, and back calculate how much nitrogen can I afford to take away from my current rate if I move from 9.7 to 11.4. And I'll take that percentage off, which happens to be 10%. So if I thought that my rate was over the top last season and I wanted to get back to 11.4, then the difference between 9.7 and 10.4 is my rate minus 10%. There is a way of doing those sort of numbers. Application method, just make sure you match it to the paddock conditions. Blake talked about tie-up coming out of, say, wheat paddocks or something with a high stubble load. Remember, in those paddocks where you've got tie-up, then banding is better than broadcasting. You could immobilise, if you do it late in the season, or you incorporate stubble, 6 to 12 kilograms of tonne of stubble that's in contact versus banding. So in those situations where you've got high residue loads, and particularly if they're going to be incorporated into the layer where the nitrogen is going to be, then you should try and band them this season, because that 6 to 12 will come back. It's part of your nitrogen bank, but it will come back possibly very late in the season for cotton, when it's probably too late to make a yield difference. It's got to be logistically practical, which means you have to have the labour. If you're going to change methods, you've got to have the equipment, the understanding, and the labour to be able to do it. If it comes down to having to prune paddocks because there is just not enough supply to come up with reasonable rates to sustain yield and the supply of product, then the logistics becomes very important, and so does banding versus broadcasting. So on a lower number of paddocks, the preference would be to go to banding, particularly pre-plant, and in any case where you've got high residue loads. And the other thing that's good about the banding situation is it can slow the nitrification and rate increase your nitrogen use efficiency. So it can act a little bit of a self-inhibitor of nitrogen release and protect it from denitrification losses. Timing, really nothing's changed here, and this is a little bit of a graph to show you. Sorry that I didn't get a chance to change this into DD 1532, but basically your important periods are 2 weeks before and 4 weeks after flowering. That's your peak. And one, you need the nitrogen to have you have the nitrogen in the crop or building up in the crop in that 2 weeks prior to flowering, so that once flowering happens, and if it's rapid, we've got a bit of a buffer in the plant. And if we have a hiccup in nitrogen supply from the roots in the first 2 weeks of flowering, we can let the plant recycle it and get us past that at least one bad irrigation or a rainfall event that might disrupt nitrogen uptake. So look at the timing and you can see why. If we can hit the timing somewhere around the 2 weeks either side of flowering, then we've got the best chance of meeting the crop's major demand. So once again, just the two scenarios I can see. The general approach, if it's high price only, use less N, but still feed most paddocks. If there's high price and short supply, invest where N behaves like a high return asset. In other words, start thinking about leaving paddocks out and fallowing them, or doing, particularly the ones that have got structural compromise through compaction or other issues, and stick to the 60 or 80% of the paddocks that are the high producers in any 1 year. How to categorise fields by their soil, water, nitrogen profile. If we've got to start culling paddocks, get rid of the ones with the poor efficiency areas. They're low yielding and they're unstable. Their yield is unstable. It is either permanently lower than the rest, or it's up and down according to factors that you don't understand. They are high risk, and if we don't have enough nitrogen to go around all your paddocks, they're the ones to start. Prioritise high yield, high stability, high efficiency paddocks. So in measuring soil N, the generalisation would be high soil N, delay application, monitor with plant testing, and adjust the rate and the timing. Those with marginal soil N, consider reducing the rate by adjusting the pre-plant application and applying most of it in crop. And where you've got low N in high reliability paddocks, apply full agronomic rate and use the most efficient placement and timing available. So fair bit to go through there, but I think it's probably time for questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. We had a question earlier on asking us if there was any known background disease to influence any yield responses to pulse crops in the rotation. I think that might have been from earlier in one of Tim's slide presentations, but I will hand over to Blake or yourself to answer that one.
The experiment Tim was referring to was on ACRI, and 100% there is a pretty decent background of vert at ACRI. I guess if I'm going to answer that question, I'd be reflecting on probably Gunnar Nachimuthu's long-term experiments, and I think Gunnar's here as well, which is also, they're also at ACRI, and he's got pulses included in that rotation. And absolutely, the cotton rotation systems there, including the pulses, do have a higher yield. And when we evaluate the disease, I guess to answer your question, it depends what you're comparing it to, right? So if we're looking at our pulse crops in a rotation system compared to just back-to-back cotton, from Gunnar's experiments, it's showing that they do have lower incidence of disease despite the pulse crops being a host themselves than compared to back-to-back cotton. And I guess, it comes down to that systems level management and systems level understanding. So I certainly wouldn't put that all down to nitrogen and nitrogen cycling. I think there's systems level stuff going on in the background there that are driving that.
Thanks, Blake. Any other questions? Aware that this has been an excellent presentation that's gone a little over time than what we promised.
Be great too if people can go through that feedback link as well. That really helps us know whether we've hit the mark or not, because ultimately we're delivering these for you. So if this is something that's been good for you, let us know. If you want to see other stuff, let us know that as well.
It looks like it's been a comprehensive presentation and no follow-up questions. But as I said, please reach out if anything springs to mind when you watch this back. Both Chris, Blake, or myself are happy to help wherever we can. Thank you very much for joining us today. As Blake said, please make sure to fill out that webinar feedback form. There's a QR code up on your screen now. Thank you, Blake, so much for coming to us with this idea and helping us host this. And thank you very much to Chris Dowling as well for presenting this afternoon.
Thanks, Megs. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.